I don't know how to get out of it. Come on, the spirits, they've got me.
Fine.
The
All right,
spirits,
go
they've
back.
got me. Oh no, the spirits.
Ah,
No, 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 they got me. Oh, get down, do it. Get to the
save
church,
yourself,
do it.
Ryan.
No, I'm trying to save me.
You're a little quiet. I'll just let you know.
A little quiet to you.
Yeah.
A little bit, and then turn this up a little bit. How about that? How about that? Check.
Yeah.
Checkity, check. Hey, check. All right, tip your waitresses. Okay.
And here we are, back again.
Eh,
What is this, the third or fourth one? Try?
maybe fifth, but whatever. It is what it is.
Okay.
I'm gonna touch my levels just a wee bit here. All right. Now that I'm done touching levels, how do we get back into this? That's so frustrating that happened. All right. Fuck.
So
Let's just jump in. All right,
let's just
everybody.
fucking jump in. America's great. We got the First Amendment. It's going through some troubling times. So
We keep rising though.
yeah.
We keep rising. Yeah. So fucking all right. Once again, getting it going. Once you're in the conversation, once you're in the pocket, it's fucking good. But getting into that pocket,
Yeah.
dude.
Yeah.
I feel like a fucking a Romanian gypsy trying to get into people's pockets all the time in Europe to get
Tell
their
me your
money.
name. Yeah, tell me your name.
Tell me your
All
name,
right, so
gypsy.
we were talking. We had a conversation the other night about this whole Spotify controversy with Joe Rogan and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell pulling their music from Spotify and the repercussions for that, and what the kind of more kind of left liberal media is saying, that Spotify should drop Joe, and so then the whole outburst of the spreading of information. Where is it? I guess the spreading of information, and another kind of area of debate is media platforms. And so, the differences between a news platform who is said that it is there to inform you with the facts versus a podcast that's there to
Entertain.
Talk and mainly to entertain, right? And
the central idea of censorship is controlling ideas and controlling the thought of the public, and it's been something that's been going on for as long as human history has been going on for. But nowadays it's so much easier to be able to censor people, and it's so much easier to put people into boxes that arguably they shouldn't necessarily be put into. And this sort of jump to the conclusion of, I disagree with your statements, or I disagree with your opinions, and therefore you should not be allowed to spread your opinions, is a scary thing to me, I think. Joe Rogan is obviously the most recent, most controversial, most talked about sort of epicenter of this idea, but it's not something that hasn't happened for years. Like it's Nazi propaganda. It's the same thing with the French Revolution. It's if you control the ideas that are being able to be spread to the populace, you control what the populace does, I guess.
It's a form of psychological warfare, maybe.
I would say so.
Psychological conformity. Yeah, it's interesting, and it's always, at least with what's going on now, is there always seems to be kind of these weird financial gains at play when all this is happening. So it's not only that people are saying certain people and the things that they say are harmful, and that A, they should be canceled, and B, that you shouldn't listen to them, but then they also have the audacity to profit off of it. And so this is a pertinent part of the kind of whole Joe Rogan controversy with Neil Young, because when Neil Young and Joan, I don't know about Joni's situation, but Neil Young pulled himself from Spotify, which he had sold, I think you said, about 50% of Neil Young identity to a company called Hypnosis, I think is what it was called. And essentially they went to Amazon and were like, well, now you can get all Neil Young here exclusively at like Apple and Amazon. And not only that, but if you join now, you get like 4 months free to listen to music free. And so it's like now, and one of the bigger questions I have about it, I feel like we might need to kind of slow down, and
I was about to say we should
explain
recap
the whole situation first. So why don't we do that first? And I feel like you're really good at explaining the whole situation.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that compliment. And I'm trying to learn how to take compliments and actually say thank you for them, because I'm not good at that. I'm autistic. That's what happens.
Hey, you did good with that compliment.
It's because I'm learning. You know what? Thank you for that recognition and that applause.
Okay. Just an hour and a half of thank you. Thank you.
For anybody who doesn't know what's going on, it's kind of baffling that you might not, but Joe Rogan Experience podcast, which first of all has been around for over a decade. You know, I've been listening to it for a super, super long time. Some of my favorite podcasts ever were on Joe Rogan. We talked about this the other day. The ones that he has with, Robert Schoch and with Randall Carlson and with what's his name? He wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods.
Oh, Graham Hancock.
Some of those are some of the most illuminating, like crazy podcasts that I've ever listened to. And I've rewatched or re-listened to them tons of times over. Joe Rogan is kind of caught up in this weird world where he has become essentially a national media player, where so many people sort of turn to his podcast for their news and their information, not through any doing of his own. He's just started a fucking podcast in like the late 2000s, and it turned into this. And
he kind of always states like, hey, I'm a fucking idiot, I'm just here to learn and to help provide illumination where there may not. And I think a part of that is his podcast has been really good at like bringing in different components of certain areas. And so he's always kind of also, with talking with Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, and Randy Carlson, it's like they're kind of on the fringe of their respective communities of, did I get their names wrong?
I just love Randy Carlson.
Randy Carlson.
I think it's Randall, but Randy Carlson is so good.
Whatever. But he provides a platform for people who, at least in that specific situation, have kind of been silenced by their respective community. And so,
sure,
he's provided a platform for just open discussion and to bring in different components to a situation, because at a certain point we're telling a story, and so there's always going to be different truths in different areas. And so he's always kind of disclosed as that,
Yeah.
I also don't think he expected his podcast and to get to the level of success where it is and to be on a platform with the amount of people that are now listening to it. So there is a
Yeah.
bit of a change there, which is new.
But that just comes with he's consistently put out. So okay, I think the main difference between like the Joe Rogan versus the quote unquote mainstream media, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Fox Newses, you know, the
News,
ABCs.
yeah, news platform.
Joe Rogan's goal with his podcast, which is the goal with any podcast, is to simply just have interesting conversations.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not necessarily going out and saying that we are a news source for you and we are here to deliver, you know, undisputed facts at all times. A
Yeah,
podcast,
he's not Alex Jones in the population.
no. And Alex Jones, essentially what he does is a podcast, but his has a much more sort of focus driven kind of like, he has his ideology that
It has an
he's,
agenda.
yeah. And Joe Rogan's podcast seems always much more to me of just like, he's in the business of having interesting conversations with people that he finds interesting. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're necessarily going to be the mainstream person or the person. I mean, even then he had Sanjay Gupta on from CNN, and that was honestly a very interesting podcast to see them go head to head. But I'm comparing the two of Joe is trying to make an interesting, entertaining discussion put out on a podcast platform. The news is there to provide you with the facts and like to bring on experts that will say what they believe is the truth of the situation. So I think it's weird. Okay, we sort of glossed over Joe Rogan's in trouble because he had some people on his podcast who are technically doctors who had some different opinions on the efficacy of vaccines and sort of how COVID and this disease is being sort of handled by, I guess, the standard doctors and sort of medical system that we have. That's why he sort of initially was being sort of run through the ringer. But that being said, Joe Rogan he's making a podcast. He's bringing on people that are interesting to him. And he never has stated that he is the news and he's the, albeit, you know, information status that like standard news operations sort of claim to be today.
And so, like, what was the whole dilemma? What was the whole issue? So you brought on these doctors, and they were kind of talking about like the efficacy levels of vaccinations, obviously pertaining to COVID because of what's been going on for the past 2 years, and the aftermath of that. Some people seem to be quite upset.
Yeah, I mean, the initial charge, I guess, if you can even call it like a charge, because it wasn't, I don't know, it's not a legal thing, but the initial sort of cancellation or attempt to cancel his platform was based on spreading misinformation, which then we get into that tricky area like you were talking about our First Amendment rights and who has the right to be able to speak on something, even if they have a divergent viewpoint than the status quo or the mainstream. And that's why it was good that we brought up Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock, because he did the exact same thing with those guys. He brought them on his podcast, even though they vastly diverge from the mainstream viewpoint of, human civilization and the history of civilization forming. That makes a good podcast, bringing on somebody that has a controversial view and maybe potentially giving them a platform and essentially allowing and trusting in the average American citizen who might watch or listen to that to be able to make their own opinions. Like, that's, I think, the thing that Joe Rogan always did on his podcast is, I'm just going to bring on people with widely diverging opinions. He has on ultra leftist people. He also has pretty hardcore conservative right-wing people. He has if you go through the whatever, like 1,700 podcasts that he's done over 10 years, it's a wide variety of people with a wide variety of differing opinions. And to say that now all of a sudden he is promoting misinformation now, when you could argue that if that's the case, then everyone is promoting disinformation, because not everybody has all the facts at all the times. And CNN and MSNBC and Fox News have put stuff on their networks that is blatantly misinformation now in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
Do we cancel Rachel Maddow? You know what I mean?
Yeah, really quickly before we dive into the whole specificity of like the issue at hand, like what's nice about those platforms that Joe Rogan is the kind of pinnacle of is when you talk you bring in these people with new ideas, new angles at looking at things and re-examining research, and so it kind of broadens the viewers awareness horizon of certain things that have kind of remained so stagnant. Like if we think about our history, if we think about anthropological studies, the example with Graham Hancock and like all those things that like for 50 or 60 years has more or less just kind of been quote unquote taken as fact. And so when it's reapproached and it kind of like has this kind of blossoming of like new insights into like our history. But when you get into a heated and debated topic of vaccinations during the time of COVID, and when so many people, right, have been over the past 2 years trying to figure out, well, what to do, what not to do. We can do this. Okay, well, now we know that this really isn't something, but now this is something. And so it's like immediately there's these, these teams, obviously, in our political spectrum where ideologies of vax, anti-vax, they pool up into these specific areas. And so then it becomes very tribal. And so when Joe Rogan brings on these doctors, and I actually haven't seen the episodes yet. I should probably watch those.
They got pulled.
Maybe
they're not on Spotify anymore, so you can't even go and watch them.
I did not know. Okay.
Yeah, so you can't even go back and see them to look at the context in which these statements that might be controversial are made.
Yeah. I wonder if he would be able to, well, under his contract to Spotify, he may not be able to, but he could put it on like a like Reddit or fucking YouTube where.
I don't think he can. I think he's exclusive to Spotify.
Yeah, fair. But yeah, it gets so heated when it comes to this like thing that we're still learning about, and this thing that is pretty tender, right? Because people are dying, loved ones are dying. How do we respond? How do we gain control of our society in the midst of this pandemic? And so a lot of people at play are really, really wanting to control the situation.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair to Joe, he, when you listen to the full context of his interviews that have been somewhat controversial, he's definitely not anti-vax. But he's also, I don't know. He seems to be more pro-health.
I think from a personal perspective, because he got COVID. Did he get vaxxed?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think he did.
And so I think himself personally might lean a little more towards, well, so here's another question. Like, he didn't get vaxxed, so it's easy to write him off as anti-vax, but maybe he just didn't want to get it. He went through COVID, got over it. You don't really necessarily need a vaccine if you've gotten over it. Now, obviously, there's new strands, and so obviously, but people could immediately discredit what I'm saying. But it's like, but his personal opinion never really got in the way of bringing information to his following.
Yeah. Well, and really, I think the initial push against Joe Rogan was when he did get COVID, because he had been talking so much on his podcast about,
Don't get that. Like, I don't think I should get vaxxed, blah, blah, blah.
well, and he's obviously
Not saying that those were his exact words.
I would say that that's a fair assumption that he said that he didn't feel like he needed to get vaxxed. I think he's pro people that are immunocompromised and have pre-existing conditions that are going to make them more likely to die or to become very, very sick with this disease. He's stated multiple times on his podcast, that he's pro those people getting the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
He's just more sort of, if you're healthy, and if it's a Hulk Hogan kind of mentality of like, if you're healthy and you take your vitamins, then you don't need to get vaxxed, brother. Okay, and as long as you pray to God and you take your vitamins and you eat steak, then you don't need to get vaccinated, brother. Okay, all right. All these people out here, dude, are telling you that you need to get vaccinated. Well, if you just eat your vitamins and pray to the Lord above and drop that smack daddy leg down on these people, then you don't need to get vaccinated, brother. Okay, dude.
Yeah.
All right.
And I mean, there's nuances with it too, right? And so it's like some people probably don't need to get vaccinated. Some people probably should get vaccinated.
Well, and
that's a gray area of people who are like, well, I probably don't have to get vaccinated, but I'm surrounded by people who probably should get vaccinated. And so does that mean I get vaccinated? And so
I think that's the exact point, is it's very nuanced. It's the media tends to throw a blanketed statement on top of somebody to tell the world this guy is against public health. You know what I mean? And it's more nuanced than that. And yeah.
And when our capitalist democracy gets involved, whether it's premeditated or not, which I like to hope that it's not premeditated, that it's just advantageous, deceitfully so, that large corporations can influence and push, get vaccinated, you need to get vaccinated, right? So it's like, I'm not saying that people shouldn't get vaccinated. I think a lot of people should get vaccinated. But to ostracize those who have defense about it, to ostracize those who are questioning how necessary is this really, and to cancel that information, really it is kind of just to snuff out any kind of opposing voices that might jeopardize their monetization.
Exactly. And what's really weird is, do you know who is one of the top advertisers on CNN?
Yes, we should.
Pfizer.
Yes. Explain all of this. There's this weird shit, and like, my references are tertiary, but it's the, to get back to the story, Joe has these doctors on these, Spotify pulls them, and that's not enough. Then Neil Young says, well, if you're going to support Joe Rogan in general, then I'm pulling myself out. So he gets pulled. Spotify loses like what, $2 billion or whatever in assets or whatever.
Like stock.
Assume from Neil Young's and Joni Mitchell and other artists pulling out. But then it's like, well, hold on. So 50% of the identity of Neil Young's music is owned by this corporation called Hypnosis, I think is what it's called. And Hypnosis had teamed up with this other company called edit.
It doesn't seem like it's actually Neil Young that is making this choice.
Blackstone.
There we go.
So Hypnosis had partnered up with Blackstone, and apparently they had been buying up neighborhoods across America, accruing all this money. Mm-hmm. And then when COVID hit, the former Hypnosis and Blackstone, who are now channeling all their profits through Neil Young into Amazon.
Which first of all, real quick, could you think of two more evil names for conglomerate corporations than Blackstone and Hypnosis?
Right?
Could you be more fucking obvious?
Dude, that's literally, we might as well just be saying like, well, Hitler and Stalin teamed up together.
Yeah, hypnosis, dude.
That's a
You
bit of
named your company
a
that's
bit of an
now
exaggeration, but
you
yeah.
named your company that is now literally disseminating a weird vibe of like this sort of tribal warfare. You called yourself Hypnosis?
Mm-hmm. Well, do you know who the new CEO of either Blackstone or Hypnosis is? Was a former CEO of Pfizer.
Oh, perfect. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So that's
And
the
so
thing.
they're using this whole like PC social justice vaccination propaganda to push profits into their margins with,
Yep.
and using Neil Young and Joni as these catalysts
Under
to
the
shift over
guy,
to Amazon and Apple.
yeah,
Under the guise of morality.
trying. Yeah, exactly. It's corporations virtue signaling how good and how how nice of benefactors they are, and how much they care about. You see the same thing when during like LGBTQ rights week and gay rights week, all the companies all of a sudden on their Twitter and on their Instagram, it has the rainbow flag sort of stamped on top of it. The corporations don't give a shit about LGBTQ rights. They just know that if they stand for LGBTQ rights, they're gonna make money.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing, how these corporations and fucking, what is it,
Blackstone.
Blackstone, like, yeah, it's their
Great head.
morality is purely based on their corporate margins, and whether or not everything is calculated in terms of how much money will we make on this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also where a large part of the Joe Rogan controversy comes from. It's clickbait. People will see controversy with Joe Rogan because he has been controversial in the past, and people will see that and they will click on it, and that's why these media stories keep getting sort of compounded on. And then all it takes is one blogger to say one thing, and then a media outlet takes that blogger's post and they make a story about it, and then it gets reblogged and restoried, and it turns into this like snowball effect. And it's purely just out of getting people to click on their videos so that that corporation can make money off of the ad revenue that they have on their webpage. It's
monetizing off of morality. It's weird.
It's capitalism.
Okay.
It's what it's inevitably always going to end up being, trending towards. It's always going to end up being the bottom dollar of any corporation or any company that makes a significant amount of money. And that's what I feel like the fundamental difference between. I mean, I stand in Joe Rogan's camp for sure. He says a lot of shit that I do not agree with at all. But he's also putting out like 10 hours of content off the top of his head every single week. If I was doing that, I would definitely, on this podcast, I've said some shit that would probably piss some fucking people off. For sure. For sure. We've made really offensive jokes that some of them have been edited out. Some of them ended up just getting left in.
Yeah.
We tried to cut out the really fucking gnarly ones, but still, like, if Joe Rogan could be canceled for the things that he said, then how would we not be getting canceled? You know what
Well,
I mean?
the only reason why we wouldn't be getting canceled is because no
we're
one's
not
listening
important
to
enough.
us.
Yeah, we're not
Yeah.
we're not nearly as influential or important enough.
So it becomes a very different ball game when you have the amount of influence that Joe Rogan has. And it's it's kind of, you become a victim of your own success at that point, right? Where anything you say can and will be taken taken against you. Is that how that expression goes?
Close enough.
Thank you.
We'll give it to you.
Cool. And and so it's very different when
all the eyeballs
you
are
are
on
in the
you.
public sphere like that, and those vipers are around, so to speak, to use your content, strip it of its context, create their own story from it, and then monetize off of it. And not only that, but spread potentially disingenuous stories about not only you, but the information that's being relayed through you and obviously your guests. And so it's dangerous. Where's my freedom?
Yeah, I thought this was America. America. Yeah, and also, so I've heard some other people talk about this, but like it's the same pattern every time of they go at something that's going to sort of spark a little bit of fire, and then they move to try and attach you with like a racism card or a misogynist card, or just like find some it seems like a never ending just digging for more dirt. And if you're somebody, and especially like when his podcast first started going, podcasts weren't a thing. It was just going out to essentially nobody. But all of that, and that's part of the reason why we end up being so free with weird fucking gross jokes or whatever, is because like sometimes you're like, well, not that many people are watching this, so I guess it doesn't really matter. We can say some fucking weird shit. And then all of a sudden, 10 years down the road, after you said something, that gets drugged up and being put as a sort of like a statement of, this is who this person is, and this is exactly what they stand for. Whereas when you're doing a podcast, sometimes you say some shit that you don't actually mean because you think it's going to be funny, or it's going to spark another topic and you're going to be able to sort of talk about that. Like, so much of it is speaking out of turn and not necessarily knowing what you're going to say before you say it. And yeah, if you have, he's got 1,700 episodes. I feel like the episodes are probably average 2.5 to 3 hours. So if you do the math on that, like you have thousands and thousands of hours of somebody just speaking into a microphone, not necessarily considering the implications of everything that they say. Yeah, if you go back through all of that, you're gonna find some fucked up shit. It's just what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And to try and hold somebody accountable, like let's say nothing was recorded and somebody had just heard Joe say something a decade ago, the same exact phrasing that he used on the podcast, but somebody just heard it in random conversation. That wouldn't be enough to pull somebody off the air or like cancel their freedom of speech. Cause like, yeah, I don't know. You're just spitballing sometimes. And that needs to be acceptable.
Yeah, I agree. Depending on the level of spitball.
Yeah, I mean, but even then, like, okay, so that kind of brings up, do we all have freedom of speech or not? You know what I mean? Like, that is part of our First Amendment rights. We should, in theory, you should be able to say anything you want that's not going to harm anybody and not going to cause damage to anything. Like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater or whatever, but freedom of speech should mean that you have freedom of speech and you can speak your mind and you can say your opinions without worries of consequences, at least from the federal government.
At least from the federal government is a good way to put it. You're always going to have repercussions, especially if you're broadcasting out to millions of people.
Absolutely. All actions have consequences. They're either good consequences or they're bad consequences. But you should have the freedom and you should have the right to be able to say what you want, understanding what those consequences might be, and still be able to put them out there on the air for everybody to hear, I feel like.
Right. But to be completely silenced or canceled.
Yeah.
Like,
no,
where is the line? Now, let me just throw a hypothetical out to you. We told the story of what's going on, right? Yeah, I think so.
What of Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the whole situation. And so, like, random hypothetical. I don't know if this is constructive or not. Let's say Joe Rogan brought on, not because he is fascist, but let's say he brought on like a Nazi or a fascist advocate just to hear their opinion. That would be pretty fucking intense.
Yeah.
Versus a doctor who is questioning the advocacy and like legitimacy of vaccinations, especially in such a quick rollout time. Now, let's say he brought on, a fascist, and that fascist was spewing his dogma. That might get a little out of hand.
Yeah. No, for sure. But I mean,
and what if, right? Because then there's also a platform of Joe disagreeing with him throughout that. And Joe always has, his weight is always going to be involved in his conversations. So he can bring on, is this constructive? I don't know.
No. I like where this is going. Yeah, no, I understand that sentiment for sure. And like, people would say like, why would you give that fascist a platform? Yada. But I'm remembering Joe had a black blues musician that I cannot remember his name right now. I'm going to try and look it up while I'm talking. It was like he's a black blues musician from the South, that has converted like 150 KKK members.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to have that person on to share their viewpoint, and ultimately it's up to his discretion who he brings on the podcast, and honestly, I feel like he, for the most part, tries to bring on people that are promoting what they think to be real. And obviously it's filtered through his opinion of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think Joe is more of a curious person than he is a malicious or malevolent being.
I don't think he's trying to push an agenda. And I looked up the name of that dude, Daryl Davis.
Yeah, Daryl Davis. Thank you.
And people look up his story. It's fascinating. And
it's one of the coolest podcasts I've ever listened to. And
yeah.
Joe Rogan did not have to have that guy on.
Yeah.
But he chose to because he thought it was a really fucking cool story. And he thought that it would be something that the world would appreciate.
Yeah.
So to demonize him as, and especially most recently now, a big edit of Joe Rogan saying the N-word a bunch of times on his podcast to try and frame him as a racist has been sort of like re-released and like repopularized, I guess.
Mm.
Yet he has a 3-hour conversation with Daryl Davis.
Yeah.
Talking about how fascinating it is. And the Daryl Davis conversation in that podcast is such a good metaphor for how we should be looking at things. Daryl Davis looked at the commonalities he had between these white racists who were in the Ku Klux Klan, and he made a connection with them. He recognized their similarities more than he recognized their differences. And that's if the media pushed that conversation on Joe's podcast as hard as they've been pushing this anti-vax stuff, which isn't even really anti-vax. It's more just talking about the lack of efficacy that was sort of like told to us initially. Either way, if they had pushed the conversation with Daryl Davis and about spreading love and spreading commonality and breaking down these barriers between blacks and white supremacists, how much better of a world would we be living in if those were the stories we were promoting, as opposed to cancel Joe Rogan, he's a racist because he has technically said the word that you're not allowed to say.
What word? No, I'm just kidding. Don't say it. It doesn't
Should we
matter.
get canceled too?
You know what the word is. One of the great...
The word is Voldemort, by the way.
Voldemort. One of the great things that Daryl Davis said that stuck with me was a lot of these Ku Klux Klan members who are stuck in their ways of belief, they're so used to not being heard, and they are ostracized. And so then they have nothing but their ignorance and hate to support them. And so by giving them a platform to sit down and express how they feel, and then to begin a discourse, and then like what you said, to like be like, hey, we're not so different, you and me. That comes through love, and that comes through hearing each other out. We don't want to hear some white dude yelling some ignorant shit about how he's a superior race when, you know, and it's like, yeah, that's gonna raise hairs everywhere, and that person is ignorant. But what if that person were to sit down with a Daryl Davis and be heard, be recognized, and then, you know, begin a discourse? Because the whole story, we won't get into it, but yeah, it's fascinating how much he just sits down and takes time with these high-ranking KKK members, and how many of them have resigned since meeting him, all from just starting discourses.
And to the point where they gave him their like ceremonial KKK robes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have never heard about that guy probably if it weren't for Joe Rogan's podcast. You know?
Hey.
And like, I think that's the fundamental issue with the sort of the standard media of today.
They have corporations and politics have their pockets in these big businesses, and they all are spinning a narrative, and everything has to fit into that narrative in order for them to make more profit.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's a very corrupt system where you have the mainstream media has loyalties to their advertisers, and they can't say anything bad about their advertisers. And like we brought up earlier, it's kind of weird that Pfizer is one of the top contributors to CNN. And the main channel on mainstream news right now who is trying to quote unquote cancel Joe for spreading misinformation is CNN. And do you remember when he first got COVID and CNN, like the footage that he put out on Instagram,
it made him look way more sick than he actually was.
Yeah, exactly.
They desaturated his skin tone. They made him look like shit.
They made him look terrible. They also went on a rampage of calling every medicine that he did horse dewormer. When ivermectin, I've heard this from many doctors, not personally, but just on interviews, on podcasts, in papers, in interviews, in magazines. Ivermectin is a widely used drug. It's used all over the world for people in not so fortunate countries. It's billions and billions of doses of ivermectin have been prescribed to people for viruses, for parasites, for all sorts of different sort of infections.
Or
And
say
then
it's like an immunity booster.
immunity,
A hard word, apparently.
immunity
Immunity.
booster. Yeah, but it is an immunity booster, and it's effective, and it's been working for a long time. And for CNN to go out of its way to describe this as purely a veterinary medicine is really suspicious, because ivermectin is a generic drug. It can't be produced by Pfizer or Moderna or any of these big pharma companies so they can make money. It's a generic drug at this point. It's been out on the market for long enough that these companies can't make exorbitant profits off of it. And because they can't make money, it really does seem like they pushed the idea of ivermectin is horse dewormer. And yeah, it is. But animals take
that's not all that it is.
animals we give Xanax to anxiety-ridden dogs. You know what I mean? We give all sorts of quote-unquote human medicine to animals. Like, we're all a part of the same family tree. Human medicine doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to work on animals, and vice versa. But to like go and promote so heavily and so blatantly that whatever Joe took was was A, not prescribed, and also B, horse medication, and just out of the woodworks, just lunacy. If you've been listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, he is obsessed with health. He's almost a billionaire probably at this point. He has the resources to literally, what he called, throw the kitchen door at COVID when he got it. And he took monoclonal antibodies, which a lot of doctors have been in support of. He took ivermectin, which a lot of doctors have been in support of. He took like all sorts of things to try and get his body back to being healthy again as quick as possible. And the idea that it's being thrown around that this is all fake news, and this is all fake news, okay, the world is upside down. It's now the liberals saying that it's fake news, that somebody got healthy by taking drugs that were prescribed by their doctor.
That's one of the bigger points that has kind of been made in the whole aftermath, this whole Joe Rogan Spotify controversy, is if we look at 2 years ago and like what the main media was kind of spewing out about COVID, they were completely wrong about. Like, first, it wasn't a big deal, and then it was, so we got to shut down. And then masks don't really work. Oh, wait, but certain masks do, so maybe you should wear masks. And then, and then it was, oh, be careful about the vaccinations. Now the vaccinations are great, and now everybody probably should do the vaccinations. And so it's like,
well, they said after your second dose, this is on CNN, MSNBC, they said after your second dose of the vaccination, you're good. You can never catch COVID again. And I get that maybe that's what the studies were saying initially, but it's still like, that's by definition as much misinformation as anything that Joe Rogan has put on his podcast. Yet because they are the corporate news,
like, the Daryl Davis point of view would be, hey, we're all fucking learning about this as we fucking go. So if a big platform like Joe is going to bring on some even semi, legit. Well, I would assume that they were legitimate doctors. I don't know who they are. I don't know who came on,
They're
but at least
as or more legitimate than a large number of like the 270 doctors that all signed a petition against Joe
there were
Rogan.
also vets. Yeah, and so it's like we're all like, if we could, and this is obviously the problem with the corporations, is because once their story gets degraded, then they lose profit, and so they need to figure out how to profitize, and so then they attack the moralities and they attack open free thinking speech, because really what should be going on is exactly what has been presented. We aren't fucking experts on these vaccinations, how they help us with COVID, what the long-term effects of these are going to be. We're fucking just juicing ourselves up a little bit. And so it's like, it's not crazy for people to have some hesitancy and understand and want to study, figure out the exact legitimacy of what we're getting into. And
Yeah.
so for that to be immediately canceled, that's some fucking Sith level shit.
Well, you kind of reminded me of so 8 months ago, 10 months ago, a year ago, if you were the person who said that this virus was made in a lab, you could lose your social media platform. If you put out a tweet or you put out an Instagram post saying that this was potentially a man-made virus that got leaked accidentally from a lab, you were kicked off of your social media platform and your ability to speak freely in the context of the world. Whereas nowadays, there's a lot of really credible people and like people in the government that are saying like, yeah, this is very likely a lab created disease that leaked. It wasn't an intentional leak. Um it wasn't a biological warfare thing, but just sometimes accidents happen. And especially when you're dealing with tiny, tiny microbes, some shit can happen. And nowadays it's not fact, but it's perfectly acceptable to believe that this is likely something that came from a lab. And people on Eric Weinstein on Joe Rogan's podcast, like pretty early into the pandemic, we're saying this is showing signs of being um, an accidental leak from a lab. Like this shows the signs of a virus that has been manipulated by humans to be more virulent, to be more spreadable, to be more infectious.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm surprised Joe didn't get banned back then. But nowadays, you should at least be able to, like,
He didn't have a deal with Spotify. That was
true.
pre-Spotify.
That was definitely pre
Might
Spotify.
have been part of it.
Maybe. Well, and that's the thing is like they can't necessarily go after Joe because Joe has fuck you money. He made $100 million off of his deal with Spotify, plus all of his all the money that he's made off of advertisements. He owns fucking On It. He works for the UFC. I'd be surprised if Joe had less than $500 million in his bank account or in assets or whatever. So Joe has fuck you money. So Joe is essentially uncancelable. But what they do is they go after, now that he has a deal with Spotify, they're going to go after Spotify because Spotify is still beholden to their shareholders. And so they have to make sure that their shareholders aren't losing money. So they're going after basically the daddy who sort of now has a piece of Joe. Whereas back in the day, his podcast was everywhere you could get podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
But now that he's beholden to a specific company, it's way easier for the media to start, and not necessarily the media, but people like Joni Mitchell and fucking what's his name, Neil Young. It created sort of an open target of like, this is an easy place to attack. Like, we can outflank this guy now that he is sequestered within Spotify.
Mm-hmm. And how much of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell is actually just Neil Young and just Joni Mitchell being like, I don't believe this is right, and the corporations who own at least half of their assets and name come in and say that.
They're both in their fucking at least 70s, maybe into their 80s. They probably don't give a shit anymore, and they're just like, whatever, I'm gonna ride this out. I'm gonna sell my music and sell my licensing.
Van down by the river.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna sell my licensing and all of my, my anthology to this big corporation for probably $50 million or some shit. I'm gonna be able to live out on a lake, maybe in a van down by the river, and spend the rest of my days fucking off. And
dude, did you remember that day in class when I was voted most likely to live in a van down by the river?
I don't.
Dude, I had to walk up in front of like 200 classmates and pick up this award. And
was that at a pep rally?
It was like in the lunchroom. I feel like it was just like a senior thing in the lunchroom. So it was kind of like a low key pep rally, but it was like the whole senior class. Yeah, it was a great time.
I mean,
I don't necessarily think I'll live the award down. Who knows?
I was gonna say, like, I feel like your overall trajectory,
right,
is leaning in that direction for sure.
Pretty much.
But yeah, like, I don't think if Neil Young gave that much a shit about Joe Rogan's right to free speech, like he gave a shit about free speech in the 70s and the 60s when, fucking the Berkeley massacre happened. Like, Neil Young was, I think he wrote a song about that shit. Maybe that was somebody else. I don't know. But either way, he was definitely.
I remember Neil Young being the Trump party when he was running for president the first term. They were using one of Neil Young's songs, I think, "Keep on Rocking in the Free World."
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Like, stop using it. And so I wonder how much of Neil Young and how much of the corporation was saying, stop using it. If I were Neil Young and Trump is using my song, I'd be like, hey man, fuck off. And it's like that one. I remember that one thinking about it as like actually Neil Young and actually Donald Trump would be like, hey man, like, can you not use my fucking song? I kind of don't support you. But
yeah, but even then, I think that was more of like, you didn't pay us for the rights to use our song.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I feel like I remember that being a prominent headline when that happened. Just like, you didn't pay us to use this song, so that's why we're really going after you.
I got to tell you, copyrights are fake news. You can copy anything you want at any time and call it yours. Trust me, I've done this. I'm really, really good at it.
Sometimes you can take a news article and put it, and if you select the part that you disagree with, you copy that, and then you put it into Word, and then you can type whatever you want in there. And therefore, the people who wrote that were absolutely promoting fake news. Okay.
I just want to make a quick note to the 5 viewers who are going to watch this that we are not Trump supporters.
We're doing better than that.
I think that this would be a good segue. Yeah. I think this would be a good segue as to, I think Ryan can agree with me in saying that, wow,
well,
kind of disagree with Donald Trump and most of what he represents.
Well, okay.
I feel like understand and defend his right to be able to express
excuse me.
and say what he feels and what he believes.
Excuse me. If you had any reason, I mean, honestly, just shut up so I can actually talk, because you keep saying that I have the right to express my opinion on anything, but you couldn't stop talking. And honestly, as the former president, it's very insulting, very mean, very, very sad. Okay? And I believe that.
Do you think Donald Trump is pretty good at playing the victim?
Is good at what? Yes, of course.
Donald Trump is good at playing the victim.
At playing what? I'm sorry. Yeah, of course, I'm very good. But I couldn't hear what you said. But yes, what did you say? Golf?
I think I still remember the point I wanted to say to keep this conversation moving along. Should I say it?
Perfect. Get back into it. There's gonna be a lot of bars. There's gonna be a lot of bars and tones in this one.
Just keep it raw. Just keep this one raw. It's great.
Lania especially likes it raw.
No,
I'm talking about the steak. She likes it rare. Okay. People.
People.
All
right. Anyways, I feel like while you and me disagree with Trump in most of his beliefs and what he stands for, at least probably 100%, I feel like we would still defend his right to express his freedom of speech, which has been a big issue not only in America but also in Canada with the whole Jordan Peterson issue at Toronto University with like gender names and profiles, and that got pretty heated.
Yeah, I mean,
obviously that wasn't a First Right Amendment, but it's the same issue at hand.
Yeah, and it's sort of like the quote from Zoolander. You know, I don't listen to Sting, but
the fact that
I really respect the fact that he's making that music.
Yeah.
To me, it sort of falls under that banner of like, you know, even though I disagree with, you know, a lot of the things that Jordan Peterson has to say on transgender people, I still think he should have the ability and the right to say it without being completely deplatformized. It's not really a word. Deplatformed. That's a better word. Deplatformed. I found it. Just because your free speech is offensive to people doesn't mean that you should not be allowed to say it. Like a lot of the stuff that we have said on this podcast would be very offensive to very strictly religious evangelical Christian people, because we've said some stuff on this podcast that would fully offend somebody who 100% believes the Bible. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be allowed to say it. We shouldn't allow other people's discomfort to not allow us to think freely.
Mm-hmm.
But other people's discomfort should absolutely be considered in what you say on a platform and what you say in a public square.
Mm-hmm.
It's a juggling act. You know what I mean?
Totally. I'm not here to defend Jordan Peterson. While I find him a fascinating kind of mad genius, and his psychological insight into mysticism and religion is nothing short of genius. I do disagree with him on a lot of issues. But he did make some really good points about this whole gender pronoun issue, and it's, you know, we should have the right to say what we want to say, and what we say has certain degrees of harm or non-harm. And so for us to say say a joke about a transgender and it be harmless versus to adamantly speak out against people who are or feel transgender and to ostracize them. Like our speech has the possibility to do both those things. But when with Jordan Peterson's whole debacle at the university, I believe that the situation was more along the lines of, hey, I don't want you to call me like any kind of male pronouns, even though I may be male, I identify as she. Can you please call me she? And so I think Jordan's whole issue was, and I guess stepping away from his defense and just the way that I kind of see it is, a lot of the time there's no way of telling how somebody identifies. And so if you see a man, a person with a penis and facial hair, and, you might call him, use male gender pronouns.
Like, hey, dude,
and
what's up, guy?
To automatically get offended and to say, no, you can't do that. Well, there's no way of you knowing. And so if someone were to approach you and say, with the same person approach you and be like, oh, hey, I identify as, she, her. So in the future, can you identify me as this? It's like, I'd have no problem calling you that. If that what makes you feel comfortable and that's what would, yeah, great. But I shouldn't automatically assume, right, that the risk is by taking certain rights away from how we identify gender and how we use it in our colloquialisms, in our speech, in our fucking speech, risks a potential like, well, then where does it end?
Well, I mean, that's actually kind of like a really good turnaround back to Daryl Davis of, if we don't have the communication, then I don't know what box to place you in. So if somebody like, in the Daryl Davis case, he's a black man and he's talking to a Klan member who is obviously a white man. If there's no initiating of that conversation of him going up to them and saying like, hey man, let's talk. Let me explain to you my perspective on things. Then he wouldn't have converted those, 50 Klan members. It's the same thing where, I would never intentionally misgender somebody, but also you got to tell me, and also understand that I might make the mistake a handful of times before it gets ingrained in my memory. Like if you are a transgender female and I knew you as Jake beforehand, and you transition and you say like, oh, actually I want to be called Molly right now, or from now on. It's like, okay, cool, awesome. I'm glad that you feel like you're happy in your own skin. Please don't be offended if I accidentally call you Jake every once in a while, because I've been calling you Jake for the past however many years that I've known you, and this is a new thing. And my sister and I talked about this on like one podcast, is the idea of just like, we just need more. The answer is more communication as opposed to less communication. So censoring inevitably is just less communication, less talking with the other side, and just shutting them up and not having that dialogue. Whereas the real answer and the real, fundamental connection and like the truth that we can land at is, let's have this dialogue, let's have this open communication, and come to it in a safe and secure setting where that I'm not trying to offend you with anything or any of the questions that I ask, and I will know that you're not trying to offend me by any of the questions you ask. And that's something that I feel like we're lacking a lot of in society, is just true open communication and like listening to both sides. Like, I'll listen to Tucker Carlson on YouTube every once in a while. I'll listen to a segment. I don't agree with it, but it's helpful to see the other side of the coin, as opposed to just going like, you know what, that person's a bigot, or that person said this or said that in transit, and you're only seeing the clip out of context. So therefore that person is evil and I will never interact with them. That gets us nowhere. And it's kind of a shame that it seems like that's where at least the corporate kind of media is leading us towards, of just, yeah, here's our side of the facts. Anybody else who says anything different is wrong, and that's misinformation. It's not fair.
It's scary.
Yeah.
Well, this was a good talk, man. Very topical.
Honestly, I think it was a good talk.
Yeah.
Honestly, maybe cancel worthy.
I'd say it's cancel worthy, and that's what makes this country so great. You get to say whatever you want, and then you have to go through dire repercussions through the corporate world. Only if you're rich and famous and successful and have
That's what I was about to say.
lots of money with all these businesses.
Yeah.
So, hey, Spotify, if you're looking for more problems,
What up?
hey.
What up?
Hey.
We're here. Cancel us.
Yeah.
We could use the free advertising and bring more eyeballs to the podcast. So cancel us. One of our more efficient, I feel like.
Yeah, we went on a slew of, at least from my side, quite faded conversations that turned into rabble quite quick.
But that's what a podcast is.
I don't regret a goddamn thing.
I regret a couple things.
Yeah, fair.
For sure.